Hello there. Let's take a little trip back in time, shall we? We are heading to a period often called the Middle Ages or sometimes the medieval era. It's a huge slice of history, stretching for about 1,000 years, roughly from the year 500 to 1500. That's a very long time indeed. It begins right after the mighty Roman Empire, that enormous, powerful civilization that ruled much of Europe, finally crumbled. Imagine a great building falling down. In its place, lots of smaller, different structures had to be built. That's a bit like what happened in Europe. This wasn't a sudden event, but a slow process of change that created a completely new world. Now, you might have heard this time called the Dark Ages. It sounds a bit gloomy, doesn't it? As if someone turned out all the lights in Europe. For a long time, people thought of it as a backward, scary period stuck between the glories of ancient Rome and the bright new ideas of the Renaissance. But that's not the whole story, not by a long shot. The Middle Ages were certainly a time of great challenges, with wars, diseases and hardships. But they were also a time of incredible creativity, faith and innovation. It was a period that laid the foundations for the modern world we live in today. So why should we care about this distant past? Well, because so many things we take for granted have their roots right here. Things like universities, parliaments, and even the books we read. The magnificent cathedrals that still stand today were born from medieval minds and hands. The languages many of us speak were shaped during these centuries. It was a time when great kingdoms were formed, new ways of living were invented, and people's relationship with God and the world around them was completely redefined. It's a fascinating, complex, and utterly human story of survival, belief, and the unstoppable march of progress. Our journey will take us through this remarkable 1,000-year span. We'll start with the chaos that followed Rome's collapse and see how new kingdoms, like the Franks, rose from the ashes. We'll explore the life of a peasant living on a feudal manor and a knight sworn to protect his lord. We'll witness the grand ambitions of popes and kings, the clash of armies in the Crusades, and the quiet dedication of monks copying manuscripts in their monasteries. It's a story filled with drama, discovery, and the everyday lives of people who, despite the centuries between us, were not so different from you and me. Let's begin at the beginning, in what historians call the early Middle Ages. This period, from about 500 to 1000, was a time of immense upheaval. The Western Roman Empire, which had been the superpower of its day, had finally collapsed. Its grand roads, laws, and armies were gone. This left a huge power vacuum, and Europe became a patchwork of smaller, often warring kingdoms. Groups of people like the Franks, the Goths, and the Anglo-Saxons moved across the land, settling down and carving out new territories for themselves. It was a messy, uncertain, and often violent time as these new rulers tried to establish control and build something new from the Roman ruins. In this fragmented world, one institution grew stronger and became a unifying force: the Christian Church. With its center in Rome, the Church provided a sense of stability and continuity that was desperately needed. Monks and nuns played a crucial role. They lived in communities called monasteries where they prayed, worked, and, most importantly, preserved knowledge. They painstakingly copied ancient texts by hand, both religious scriptures and classical works of philosophy and science. Without these dedicated scribes, so much of the wisdom of the ancient world would have been lost forever. The Church became the spiritual heart of Europe, influencing everything from law and politics to art and daily life. Meanwhile, while Europe was busy rebuilding itself, another great civilization was rising to the southeast. This was the Islamic world. Following the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, Arab armies expanded rapidly from the Arabian Peninsula, creating a vast empire that stretched from Spain all the way to India. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was the dawn of an Islamic golden age. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became brilliant centers of learning and culture. Scholars there made incredible advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, preserving and building upon the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Persians. Back in Europe, a new system for organizing society began to take hold. We call it feudalism. It emerged as a practical solution to the constant threat of invasion and lawlessness. Kings and powerful lords couldn't protect all their lands by themselves, so they granted large parcels of land, called fiefs, to lesser nobles or vassals. In return for this land, the vassals pledged their loyalty and military service. This created a pyramid of power, with the king at the very top and layers of nobles beneath him. It was a system built on personal oaths and obligations, a way to maintain order in a dangerous and decentralized world. So, how did this feudal system actually work in practice? Let's imagine a medieval manor. At the top was the lord, the nobleman who controlled the land. He lived in a castle or a large manor house, which offered protection for everyone in the area. His main job was to provide knights and soldiers to his own superior lord or to the king when called upon. In exchange for their loyalty and service, his vassals, the knights, received smaller plots of land. These knights were the professional warriors of the age, clad in armor and trained for combat. Their whole life was dedicated to defending their lord's territory and upholding a code of honor known as chivalry. Beneath the nobles and knights were the vast majority of the population, the peasants. Most peasants were serfs, which meant they were not free. They were tied to the land they worked on and could not leave without the lord's permission. They weren't exactly slaves, as they couldn't be bought and sold like property, but their lives were incredibly hard and restricted. They spent their days toiling in the fields, cultivating crops like wheat, barley, and oats. A large portion of everything they produced had to be given to the lord as rent. They also had to work on the lord's own private land for free for a certain number of days each week. Life for a peasant family was dictated by the seasons. Spring was for ploughing and planting, summer for tending the crops, and autumn was the crucial harvest time. Winter was a lean, cold period spent indoors, mending tools and trying to make food supplies last. Their homes were simple wooden huts with thatched roofs and earthen floors, often shared with their livestock. Diet was basic, consisting mainly of dark bread, vegetable stew, also called pottage, and whatever else they could grow or forage. Meat was a rare luxury. It was a life of constant back-breaking labor with very little reward, all in service to the lord who offered them protection in return. This entire structure was built on a series of mutual obligations, even if they were very unequal. The peasants worked the land and provided food and labor. The lord, in theory, provided protection from bandits and invading armies, as well as a place to run to in times of danger, the castle walls. He also administered justice, settling disputes among the villagers. The church provided spiritual comfort, promising a better life in the hereafter in exchange for faith and obedience on earth. This rigid social hierarchy, where everyone knew their place, was the defining feature of medieval society for centuries, a system designed for survival in a fragmented world. After the struggles of the early Middle Ages, Europe began to experience a period of remarkable growth and stability from about 1000 to 1300. We call this the High Middle Ages. The climate became a bit warmer, which led to better harvests. New farming techniques like the heavy plough and the three-field system of crop rotation made agriculture much more productive. This meant there was more food to go around. With more food, the population began to grow steadily for the first time in centuries. This created a new sense of energy and confidence across the continent, a feeling that things were finally getting better. This growing population and agricultural surplus had a huge effect on society. For one thing, not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. Some people could specialize in other crafts, becoming blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, or bakers. This led to the revival and growth of towns and cities. Old Roman towns that had shrunk were revitalized, and brand new towns sprang up near castles, monasteries, or important crossroads. These bustling urban centers became hubs of trade and industry. Merchants formed guilds to regulate their trade, and artisans formed guilds to control the quality and price of their goods, creating a new and powerful middle class of townspeople. With the growth of towns came a boom in trade. Merchants traveled further than ever before along old Roman roads and dangerous sea routes. They brought exotic goods from the east, spices, silks, and perfumes to the markets of Europe. Great trade fairs were held in places like the Champagne region of France, where merchants from all over the continent gathered to buy and sell their wares. This new commercial activity led to the increased use of money and the development of banking. Cities in Italy, like Venice and Genoa, became incredibly wealthy and powerful by controlling the lucrative trade routes across the Mediterranean Sea. This new energy also fueled a thirst for knowledge. The High Middle Ages saw the birth of the first universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These were not campuses with leafy grounds, but communities of scholars and students who came together to study subjects like theology, law, and medicine. They rediscovered the lost works of ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle, often through translations from Arabic scholars. This sparked a new way of thinking called scholasticism, which tried to use logic and reason to understand matters of faith. It was a period of intellectual awakening, proving that the Dark Ages were anything but dark. The confidence and wealth of the High Middle Ages, found its most spectacular expression in architecture. This was really the great age of cathedral building. All across Europe, towns competed with each other to build the biggest, most beautiful churches to glorify God. The earlier Romanesque style featured thick, heavy walls, small windows and rounded arches, giving buildings a solid, fortress-like feel. But then, a revolutionary new style emerged: Gothic. Gothic cathedrals reached for the heavens with pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and, most famously, flying buttresses. These external stone supports allowed the walls to be thinner and much, much taller. These soaring Gothic structures were engineering marvels. Their thin walls could be filled with huge stained glass windows, which flooded the interiors with colourful divine light. These windows weren't just for decoration, they were Bibles for the poor. For a population that mostly couldn't read, the images in the glass told the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints. Building a cathedral was a massive community project that could take generations to complete. It involved the skills of countless stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and artists, and it was a powerful symbol of a city's faith, pride, and prosperity. They were truly sermons in stone. At the same time, the castles of the nobility were also evolving. Early medieval castles were often simple wooden forts on a hill called motte and bailey castles. But during the High Middle Ages, they transformed into the formidable stone fortresses we imagine today. They became complex defensive structures with thick curtain walls, tall towers, battlements, and moats. They were designed to withstand long sieges, with features like gatehouses with deadly portcullises and arrow slits for archers. These castles were not just military strongholds, they were also the administrative centers of the Lord's domain and powerful symbols of his authority and control over the surrounding countryside. This era's ambition and religious fervor also spilled out beyond Europe's borders in a series of military expeditions known as the Crusades. In 1095, the Pope called on Christian knights to travel to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from its Muslim rulers. The First Crusade was surprisingly successful, capturing the city, but it led to nearly 2 centuries of conflict. While the Crusades were framed as holy wars, they were also driven by politics, greed, and a thirst for land and adventure. Though they ultimately failed in their long-term goal, they had a profound impact, increasing the power of kings, stimulating trade with the East, and creating a legacy of mistrust between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Just as the High Middle Ages had been a time of growth, the period that followed, from about 1300 to 1500, was a time of crisis and decline. We call this the Late Middle Ages. It was, honestly, a turbulent and difficult era, marked by famine, plague, and warfare. The good weather of the previous centuries came to an end, and a little ice age began, leading to colder, wetter weather and widespread crop failures. This caused a devastating famine in the early 14th century, weakening the population and setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe to come. The confidence and optimism of the High Middle Ages began to crumble under the weight of these immense challenges. In 1347, a terrible disease arrived in Europe, carried on merchant ships from Asia. It was the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death. Spreading rapidly along trade routes, it was a terrifying and unstoppable killer. Within just a few years, it had swept across the entire continent, killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. The social and economic consequences were staggering. Whole villages were abandoned. The feudal system was thrown into chaos because there were no longer enough peasants to work the land. Labor became scarce, and for the first time, surviving peasants could demand higher wages and better conditions, shaking the very foundations of the old social order. As if plague and famine weren't enough, this was also an age of brutal and prolonged warfare. The most famous of these conflicts was the 100 Years' War, fought between the kings of England and France from 1337 to 1453. It was not a single continuous war, but a series of devastating campaigns that ravaged the French countryside. This war saw the introduction of new military technologies, like the English longbow and later cannons, which could batter down the walls of stone castles. These new weapons began to make the heavily armoured knight on horseback obsolete, further undermining the feudal military system that had dominated the medieval battlefield for so long. The church, which had been the bedrock of medieval society, also faced its own crises. Many people felt the church had become too wealthy, too involved in politics, and too corrupt. This dissatisfaction grew during the Western Schism, a period when there were two, and for a time even three, rival popes, each claiming to be the true head of the church. This division seriously damaged the prestige and authority of the papacy. At the same time, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 was a huge psychological blow to Christendom. It marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and shifted the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. While Europe was going through its medieval journey, it's so important to remember that it was just one part of a much larger, interconnected world. Other civilizations were flourishing, creating their own magnificent histories. The Islamic world, for example, continued to be a beacon of science and culture. Great empires like the Ottomans in Turkey and the Mughals in India rose to power. Cities like Istanbul and Delhi became centers of stunning art, architecture, and learning. These empires controlled vast trade networks that linked Asia, Africa, and Europe, spreading goods, ideas, and technologies across continents in a way that Europeans were only just beginning to understand. In China, this period saw the rise and fall of several powerful dynasties. The Tang and Song dynasties, for instance, presided over a golden age of stability and invention. Chinese engineers and scientists were far ahead of their European counterparts. They invented things that would change the world, including gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and, most importantly, printing with movable type. These inventions would eventually make their way to Europe and have a revolutionary impact. Later, the Ming dynasty built the incredible Forbidden City in Beijing and sent enormous treasure fleets, commanded by the Admiral Zheng He, on epic voyages across the Indian Ocean decades before Columbus sailed west. Africa, too, was home to powerful and wealthy kingdoms. In West Africa, the Mali Empire and later the Songhai Empire grew fabulously rich from their control of the trans-Saharan trade routes. They traded vast quantities of gold and salt, and their cities, like the legendary Timbuktu, became famous centers of Islamic scholarship and trade, boasting great libraries and universities. Further south, the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe built impressive stone structures without mortar, the ruins of which still puzzle and amaze us today. These African empires were sophisticated societies with complex political systems and vibrant cultural traditions. And far across the Atlantic Ocean, civilizations in the Americas were developing in complete isolation from the rest of the world. In Central America, the Maya built stunning temple pyramids and developed a complex writing system and an incredibly accurate calendar. Later, the Aztec Empire built its magnificent capital city, Tenochtitlan, on an island in a lake, a marvel of engineering with canals and floating gardens. In South America, the Inca Empire created a vast and highly organized society in the Andes Mountains, connected by an ingenious system of roads and bridges. These civilizations had their own unique religions, technologies, and ways of life, completely unknown to the people of Europe, Africa, and Asia. By the late 15th century, the world of the Middle Ages was clearly coming to an end. The many crises of the late Middle Ages had broken down the old certainties, but they had also cleared the way for something new to be born. The feudal system, already weakened by the Black Death, was losing its grip. Kings were growing more powerful, centralizing their authority and creating stronger, more unified nations. They built professional armies, paid for by taxes, which were more reliable than feudal knights. The old pyramid of power, with its layers of loyalties between lords and vassals, was being replaced by the idea of a single nation ruled by a single monarch. A powerful new cultural movement was also sweeping across Europe, starting in the wealthy city-states of Italy. We call it the Renaissance, which means rebirth. It was a movement inspired by a renewed interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers and artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo looked back to this classical past for inspiration, but they also celebrated human potential and achievement in a way that was new. This humanist way of thinking focused more on life on Earth rather than solely on the spiritual world, and it sparked an explosion of creativity in painting, sculpture, and architecture. One invention in particular helped to spread these new ideas like wildfire: the printing press. Around 1450, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg perfected a system of printing with movable metal type. Before this, books had to be copied by hand, a slow and expensive process that made them rare luxuries for the rich. Now, books could be produced quickly and cheaply in huge numbers. This printing revolution meant that knowledge, including the Bible, classical texts, and new scientific ideas, could spread to a much wider audience than ever before. It fueled the Renaissance, powered the Protestant Reformation, and changed the way people accessed information forever. Finally, Europeans began to look outward beyond the boundaries of their known world. Spurred on by a desire for the riches of the East and equipped with new technologies like the compass and better ships, explorers set sail on daring voyages. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, reached the Americas, opening up a new world that Europeans never knew existed. A few years later, Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to reach India. These voyages of discovery dramatically expanded Europe's understanding of the globe. They connected continents that had been separate for millennia and set in motion a new age of global trade, empire, and exchange that would utterly transform the planet. So, our long journey through the Middle Ages comes to a close. We've traveled from the rubble of the Roman Empire to the dawn of a new global age. We've seen how a fragmented and fearful society slowly rebuilt itself, creating new ways to live, govern, and believe. We've explored the rigid world of the feudal manor, marveled at the soaring ambition of Gothic cathedrals, and witnessed the clash of armies under the banner of the cross. It was a period of immense contrast, of deep faith and brutal violence, of staggering ignorance and brilliant innovation, of terrible hardship and incredible artistic beauty. It was far from being just a dark age. The Middle Ages were the crucible in which modern Europe was forged. The political map of today, with nations like France, England, and Spain, began to take shape during these centuries. The fundamental struggle between the power of the Church and the power of the state, a theme that runs through all of Western history, was a central drama of the medieval period. Our legal systems are indebted to medieval concepts of law and justice. Even our romantic ideas of knights in shining armor and fair maidens, however fanciful, are a legacy of the medieval code of chivalry and the stories that were told about it. It was also a time that laid the intellectual groundwork for what was to come. The monks who preserved ancient knowledge in their monasteries and the scholars who debated in the first universities kept the flame of learning alive. They created the very institutions that would later fuel the scientific revolution. The merchants and bankers who developed new commercial practices in the growing towns created the foundations of a capitalist economy. The crises of the late Middle Ages, as terrible as they were, forced society to adapt and change, ultimately leading to the end of serfdom and the rise of a more dynamic and mobile social structure. Ultimately, the story of the Middle Ages is a profoundly human one. It teaches us about resilience in the face of disaster, about the power of faith to shape societies, and about the unending human quest for knowledge, beauty, and a better world. It reminds us that history is not a simple story of progress from dark to light, but a complex and often messy process of change, conflict, and creation. The people of the Middle Ages built the world they knew, and in doing so, they laid the foundations of ours. Their voices, their struggles, and their triumphs are woven into the very fabric of our modern world.